Welcome to the IRDL Scholars Speaker Series. The series is coordinated by a working group of librarian researchers who participated in a professional continuing education program called the Institute for Research Design in Librarianship. We welcome you today from the William H. Hannon Library at Loyola Marymount University, the home of IRDL. My name is Marie Kennedy. I'm the Serials and Electronic Resources Librarian and the co-director of IRDL. Welcoming you also is Christine Brancalini, co-director of IRDL and Dean of the Library. We designed this series to challenge what we know of traditional ways of conducting research. As librarians, educators, and researchers, we welcome this opportunity to reflect and think about how to incorporate what we learned from the speakers in the 2022 series. Today, you'll hear a brief recap of each of the speakers, and then we'll have a discussion. We welcome you to join us in the discussion. The Q&A as well as the chat have been enabled. Please use the Q&A to direct questions to the committee and use the chat for commenting and sharing your thoughts with the group. We're recording this session and it will be made publicly available on LMU Library's YouTube channel soon. We'll be using the live transcription provided by Zoom. We want this to be an uplifting and positive discussion. It's a professional event and we will not tolerate any disrespectful comments in the session. We reserve the right to remove anyone from today's session if we observe anything that does not honor this community. I'll now turn it over to the organizing committee to begin the discussion. Team, over to you.
Thanks, Marie. All right, everybody, I'm just going to share the slides and we can get started. Give me a minute. All right. How's that looking?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, I guess I'll just quick introduce myself. Dana, we're up first, so we'll just do a quick introduce ourselves and then we'll jump right in. Sound good?
Sure.
Okay, so my name is Catherine Baird, and I'm at Montclair State University in Northern New Jersey. And my co-organizer, Dana, I'll let you introduce yourself.
My name is Dana Staton Thompson. I am a research and instruction librarian at Murray State University, which is in Murray, Kentucky.
All right, so Dana and I are up first because we moderated the first session, and I think I've got it up on the screen there now, where our guest speaker was Emily Ford, who spoke to the group about narrative inquiry. So I think what we're going to do is each of the moderating groups is going to give a brief recap of the sessions. So as I said, Dana and I are up first, and then we'll be able to kind of have a grander discussion talking about all of the different speakers in the speaker series kind of afterwards. I was going to say sound good, but we're in a webinar, so no one can say it doesn't sound good. So I'm just going to go ahead with that plan. All right, so Dana, how about we just start off and talk a little bit about Emily and narrative inquiry. Do you want to start us off?
I can. So narrative inquiry is qualitative research methodology that examines human experiences through stories. So one of the really interesting things about Emily's work was that there's actually kind of a reflective process built into it to examine the narrative. So when you are learning somebody's story, kind of the question of ownership comes into play, right? The researcher versus the person telling the story. And so that back and forth review process, we kind of found that interesting. And then noting that, of course, it is an interpretive narrative, right? It's it can be reordered. It includes reflections, impressions, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest takeaway for me from Emily's talk when she, about this methodology. the idea that you're like you still have a transcript that you're creating and you're listening to the transcript, but instead of just going through and marking themes, what you're doing, as Dana just said, is really kind of reinterpreting, redoing, like finding the story rather than finding themes. And so the final document that you produce, although Emily noted that there is maybe necessarily no finality in the document because it is such an ongoing iterative process, but the document that is produced, the interpretive narrative, that is that collaborative narrative with the person that was interviewed. And yeah, you're chopping things up and reordering them and including an intellectual response and impressions. So it was, I think for me, and we can talk about this more later, it was definitely a different approach than what I had thought about for qualitative analysis. So shall we share? So we're not going to discuss the questions right now, but we'll share the questions that we think might be useful for us to talk about as a group. So the first question is, so can you imagine where in LIS this method might be beneficial? Emily talked and discussed using it in investigations of promotion and tenure, but also highlighted the idea of possibly exploring the experiences of librarians in community colleges or those who are in like one-person libraries. So that was one question. And Dana, did you want to?
Sure. We also kind of thought it might be interesting to determine what types of interview questions could lend themselves more to this method. Timeline questions, anything that has to do with like a linear property, understanding like that iterative process. So if you don't, maybe you don't fully do narrative inquiry with your research, but are there certain aspects of that you could integrate into your practice?
All right, so we've got a slide here with a couple of readings on it. Those can also all be found on the link that Marie started us off with, where the entire speaker series is documented with all the YouTube recordings. So I'll breeze past that, and I'm gonna turn it over now to my colleagues who are gonna talk about the next talk.
Hi, everyone. So Rosalinda and I facilitated the discussion with Jennifer Esposito, who is an intersectional qualitative researcher. And what she really talked about is how intersectional qualitative research requires the researcher to consider the complexity of lived experience in relation to different systems of domination in their methodological approaches. IQR claims that research needs to represent intersectional concerns, and this includes steps along the research process from why, thinking about why you'd want to conduct a research study, to the questions that you ask in interviews, how you sample and recruit participants, how you collect data, how you interpret the data, and then how you represent and communicate research. And one thing that really struck me from Dr. Esposito's research, her talk, was her discussion of the ethic of humility that it's important for researchers to bring to the process when they're approaching subjects and in the way that they interact with subjects and think about the impact of their research. I thought that was a really important concept for us to keep in mind. I see that Rosalinda is here. I don't know, Rosalinda, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm coming in a little late today. Yeah, I think what could be really expansive and really intimidating about this type of approach is that it really can link into every step of the process. And so having the space to kind of think through how intersectional approaches apply in all of these different places in the research design process, I think could be intimidating for people, but I think it ultimately, hopefully, can help you create a more or just create more fruitful discussions about your research in general and kind of why you're doing it and all these other steps. So I think that's what our discussion is going to really ask about.
Yeah, so if you'd like, we can move on to the next slide that has our discussion question. So to Rosalinda's point, can you think about how you might implement IQR in LIS research design specifically? And so think through all the following steps in the design process that we have listed here. How would you implement IQR into each of those steps? So we can come back to that question in the discussion section. On the next slide, we have a few suggested readings from Dr. Esposito and her co-authors.
Okay, I think it's our turn. I'm Michael Florell. Kathy Meals and I facilitated Jonathan Rose's talk. And he's a sociolinguistic faculty member in sociolinguistics or sociocultural and linguistic anthropology, a number of different fields. Just a few highlights from his talk. You can kind of read some of the basics, but Jonathan kind of challenged, I guess, an ivory tower conception of research, seeing academia as needing to be a little bit more porous with the local communities in which they're situated rather than distinct and separated. Jonathan also, I thought interestingly, kind of investigated both in his research and his talk, discussed intersections of race, language, colonialism, local and national government, structures of inequality. It was fascinating to see all these different dimensions and aspects kind of intersect in a number of different ways. That was interesting. His research also, while was focused on historical context, but also being evidence-based. I think it's important to note that he, in his research, if you read it, there's usually like a section providing historical context, which I thought was useful and makes his work maybe more persuasive or more robust. And then lastly, something that's not necessarily in his research, but something he talked about that I think is worth pointing out is that he had a really, he also talked about humility. And he also had a specific conception of what it meant to create knowledge through the research methods he used regarding the research questions he was pursuing. And so he kind of had an epistemology really for his research and for his research process. He had made very specific claims about how knowledge is created, while also recognizing, while also trying to be humble, I guess, or displaying humility and how to go about achieving that knowledge. So those are some high-level takeaways from Jonathan's talk. And Catherine, could you advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. So there's a few topics here we could discuss or we could bring up in a discussion. One is action research. How could that be used for LAS research or for research for information literacy? There's some of that in the literature. I don't know if I would call that a tradition, but it exists. But could that be furthered, or could there be more of it? And then also, are there topics in LIS that could use this type of treatment that questions these intersections of race, linguistics, government, colonialism, etc. But then also, I guess also just another point here is that Jonathan kind of was more comfortable with things being not fully settled. So for instance, the concept of Latinx, there's still some debate about that, but he used that and other concepts all fluidly and said that this was kind of part of the process of research and part of the field. And I thought that was a fascinating take on that, which could be a difficult topic. So how could LIS, what are fluid concepts in LIS, and are we not comfortable having concepts or ideas or methods kind of be more up in the air? So I think that's a good high level reading. There's some of his work. Honestly, he's a great writer, so I would recommend all of this. So, and I think that's it for me. I'll leave it up to the next group.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm Sophie Rondell, and my moderator in crime was Letha Miles Edmondson. And just bear with me, I lost my notes. Hang on. Okay. So Letha and I moderated this session with Dr. Sarah McClelland, who is an associate professor of psychology and women's and gender studies. Dr. McClelland's talk explored racist and sexist stereotypes in survey research. She explored 3 critical research methods that we wanted to just mention: the self-anchored ladder, item bank, and cognitive debriefing. The self-anchored ladder is a procedure that simultaneously collects a participant's self-reported rating and their interpretation of that rating. Sarah focused on how she used the self-anchored ladder in her study of sexual satisfaction in young adults. Sarah and her colleagues used the item bank method to explore racist and sexist attitudes in abortion research. She demonstrated how the item bank revealed how inequality, prejudice, and discrimination can be reproduced in the fabric of research methods, and shared examples from the general social survey. And the last method that Sarah touched on is the cognitive debrief method, and how it can be used to understand what participants were thinking about when they answered the question, and how their responses are shaped by the discourse around that topic. So next slide, and I'll pass it over to Letha.
So Dr. McClelland's lab and approach to survey research methods really could improve how we engage with research and how we identify and ask effective questions. Like, are the questions we ask understood in the way that we intended? I looked at some of the work being done at the Progress Lab, and I hope you will too, because their approach for these ongoing projects and collaborations really could influence how we might create new kinds of research in our field. And I would like to move on to the next slide, because Sophie and I really sort of spent some time going through the many publications of Dr. McClelland, and we chose these 2 in particular because they were closely related to the presentation, but also really provided further insight, especially if you choose to incorporate this sort of self-anchored ladder when you are designing your own research. And so I think that will conclude what we have to say. And now let's open it up for discussion.
Okay, I think I successfully stopped the share, right? Yeah. This is more just, maybe I'll start off with an observation, if that's okay with folks. One of the things, even just as everyone was recapping, that I guess maybe 2 things that I kind of noticed that I think is in common across all of the talks. One was how much more the participants or subjects are involved in the research. I'm probably stating the obvious, but that's a good way to start, right? And I remember, like, when I was first at IRDL and first going down this path of maybe expanding beyond the methodology of the survey, that wasn't even really on my radar at all. So it's just interesting how that's, you know, so present in all of the sessions of the speaker series. And the second thing that I just see as a common theme across all the talks was kind of I'm not sure if someone said humility The ethic of humility, sorry, was that Hillary? Was that you? Yeah. And that was something I noted as well in narrative inquiry, like how like you're not, there's no more hiding kind of behind behind your data, kind of the vulnerability also of the researcher alongside the research participants. I thought that was interesting. So there we go. I broke the ice. I started us off with one observation, but I didn't answer a question or pose one.
See, we got in the chat a comment from Chris that all these scholars' work interests me, but I had specific ideas that we could include in our research. I'm interested in the research journey of librarians. I think Ford's storytelling method could be useful because every researcher's story would be different. Yeah, and related, one of the things that stood out to me we got into at the end of Jonathan Rosa's talk was this idea of slow research, right? Because so much of what he does is participatory action research, which requires just a ton of legwork and background and structure and planning that goes on and on and on. And so I was sort of struck by that and have been left thinking about how we can do that and how that would benefit us as actually practicing librarians, not just researching librarians, because our job is teaching research and information literacy, among other things, right? And so being involved in that kind of a methodology actually fits really well with our daily work.
What were other people's reactions to the slow research? It really, I think Emily Ford discussed the kind of the idea that she had to produce something, right? Like the idea that the research method was really sometimes influenced by how much time you had before your tenure clock stopped ticking. So when that came up in that talk, I was like, oh yeah, slow research, but it's just not always going to fly all the time for depending on people's contexts and situations and just how complex that is. But what were other people's reactions to that?
Yeah, Catherine, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just to say I had a similar reaction too, and related to that was in a couple of instances, I think we asked Dr. Esposito and Dr. Rosa about pushback to their work, for being too radical or too historically contextualized or too fill in the blank, right? And we said, so what's your reaction been to that? And they were basically both like, I don't care. This is the truth, and this is the research that I'm doing, and too bad, right? And I really appreciated that, but I also know that exists in tension with that kind of like need to publish now that keeps resulting. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to say something similar. It almost feels like you're an early adopter to a technology, like that's superior, right? Like slow research. I mean, Jonathan talked about his process of forming these questions, and it's really quite intentional. It's thoughtful in how he integrates. He views the community as part of knowledge creation, as well as him as the researcher. So he's really sophisticated in his approach. But all that being said, like at the end of the, there's that, and then there's the other end of like, well, you need to get X amount done over Y amount of time, right? So maybe it could just be like the virtue of tenure, needing to push others or something like that. I mean, I think there's like power dynamics here within academia that need to be recognized, right? Because is it practical to study something for 3 years in an academic life? I mean, just to throw out an arbitrary number, I don't know. Some places that might be acceptable, other places that might not. So it's that being said, like the scholarship is probably more solid, right? Like if you take a case study that was whipped up and published within a year versus like a 2 to 3 year study, that's going to be better scholarship at the end. So the metric for research can't just be simply number of published articles or productivity in that sense. There has to be some type of measure for quality.
I think what might be unspoken is that there are a lot of collaborations. And so while there might be this slow research process, there are so many other collaborations where things are being published and information is being put out there. And so I think that if we really want to do people-centered research in our field, we might be able to get a lot of buy-in if we collaborate across libraries and across disciplines, so that we can sort of incorporate this slow research process, but still actually have some actionable, publishable resources that really could sort of move the field forward.
And it doesn't hurt to spread out the target. If you get a target on your back for being slow, it doesn't hurt to collaborate and spread that out with other people. Sorry, I spoke over someone.
I really like that comment, because that's something I've been thinking about a lot with a couple of colleagues right now. We're working on a research study. We're currently, collecting data and doing interviews about how faculty design research assignments, the considerations they come into, their own experiences, learning to do research, learning goals, all kinds of things like that, how they teach it. And one of our, I don't think this is, too much of a spoiler or anything, but like one of our interviewees said it would be really interesting to see how this compares across institutions, right? And that's something we're like, yep, that's kind of where we want to go long term. So I'm just calling this out. So if you want to work on spreading this to a multi-institutional research project, I'm here for it.
Chris has asked, what do you think about including the community in our research? They would be collaborators. I think that's huge.
I don't mean to put anybody on the spot, but I know Rosalinda's research was in collaboration with students, right? This is something I would love to do. And again, it's the time-consuming, slow stuff, but maybe, Rosalinda, what are your thoughts?
It's slow. It's so slow. Yeah, I haven't published anything or put out anything related to that research yet. But as you all were talking, I was thinking about, but I have with another IRDL scholar, Haley Fargo, we've put out an article, or we will have an article in October in Portal about kind of about our methodology of working with students. So it seems to me like there's a lot of room. If you're doing slow research, or if this is something that's important to our field, then we should make room to investigate the methods behind it and the ones that we think work well and don't, and be able to publish that as a valid form of research. I think it gets to what Marie just put in the chat about the library anxiety scale. Like, let's look at some of these methods and let's look at some of the things we've already used, and like maybe we need a new LIS methods journal. I don't know if we have one. We probably do. Sorry, everybody, I have no idea. But I think that can be helpful, because for me, a lot of the deep thinking I do is about my approach to working with the racialized communities that I work with. And I don't want to cause any harm. And it's about more than just benevolence. I think it goes much deeper than that. And I think we've heard that from a lot of these scholars, that it's more than just that. And so having a space, I think, within our profession to disentangle a lot of these different methods that we've heard about from other fields, bring them into our own, and actually just investigate them as methods, not as a means to an end to come up with some, product that's going to benefit our library. I have anti-institutionalist leanings anyway, but that's not my goal, and it isn't. My goal isn't to necessarily benefit my library, but it's to benefit the community that I'm working with and that I work for, and stuff like that. I'll stop now. Those are my thoughts.
Just real briefly, it looks like Marie has something, and I do want to ask you, Marie, to clarify or to further explicate. But Rosalinda, there's a whole thing I've been advocating for called the Students as Partner movement. It's kind of in the scholarship of teaching and learning kind of world. But basically, it talks about co-teaching basically with students and taking in the student perspective more, but also students as research partners is legitimate. You don't need a PhD from a top 20 school type of thing in order to do research in this area. Students can be active collaborators and active researchers, co-researchers. And they have a whole free book series, and I would really recommend it. Maybe Marie, can I put you on the spot? Could you further explain what you put in the chat?
I hope it's okay if I just unmute. I'm going to paste into the chat a URL. There's a little LibGuide from Washington State University called Library Anxiety, How to Beat It. And it's just 4 questions long, and it's modeled after the library anxiety scale. But the first question, well, let's see, that's maybe not a good one. I think question 3 bears some investigation. The question reads, I am unsure about how to begin my research. And it's a Likert scale. You get to choose between 1 and 5, strongly agree and strongly disagree and strongly agree. So what would it be like if we approached a student to tell us what that means? How are they interpreting that question? I am unsure about how to begin my research. Like, begin, I would like them to tell us what beginning means. I'd also like them to tell us more about what unsure means. And this only came to mind because I've seen the results of things like LibQual or ClimateQual, and you get the results and you're like, I have no idea what to do with the resulting data. And it's because I don't know how people have interpreted the questions. Well, what would it mean if we asked them that up front? There are different communities that are answering these questions. What if there's a community effect that we don't know about that would interpret how they're thinking about these things? So that's an example of what I mean.
Yeah, and this is why that's one of the reasons I really loved Sarah McClellan's talk. Was that idea of kind of, breaking apart the survey scales and challenging it and letting participants self-define what those things mean. This is something I haven't done research on or don't have anything, in the pipeline or anything, but getting students to self-identify what those challenges are with research is something I think about in my instruction capacity and try to do kind of some formative assessment at the beginning, so asking students to draw their research process as kind of a warm-up activity to see where the pitfalls are and what some of the feelings that come up are, or the first 3 words that come to mind or feelings that come to mind when somebody says you have a research assignment, right? Just to kind of gauge where people are, because research is such an emotional process, and responding to these answers brings up such emotion that I really appreciated her attention to how this method gives people a chance to respond to that, to define exactly what it is they mean.
Also to provide students a space, making some assumptions here, but most of the students we engage with are going to be at the undergraduate level. Typically, for me, there's 2 extremes. There's either the student who's just brand new to undergraduate research, and how different it is from like research the high school level or previously, and then you have the advanced student who's just trying to get into it's their seminar, their ultimate final semester seminar, and they're starting to do that's a different kind of dimension there. But that's only limited. A lot of our focus, I would say, seems to be on helping students master their current information environment but how translatable is that to after they graduate? 95+% of students will not have access to the databases and will not be using information in a similar way. So we're focusing on those 4 years where we could really help them develop or at least question their information practices, their habits, their skills, their own systems they create for how they gather and synthesize and communicate information. I think that's a big gap for us, practically speaking, for preparing students after they get out of college. It's a big enough gap. It's a big enough task, I'm sure, to get them to be successful in college. But I guess seeing some of these researchers, it gets me questioned, like, what's really essential? What's most important? You know, if I were to do one research project for the next 2 years, what would be the question in which I'm investigating? And that would be it for me, I think.
But I think the point of what some of they're saying is that you might not know that. You could sit in your office for 2 years and not figure it out. So you need to talk to your community to find that out. You know?
Absolutely.
Like that, I think that's the whole point. It's like maybe we don't know the best questions to ask because we're not a part of it. So we need to incorporate those communities so they can, and it might take a while to get us there, because it takes me a while to get my students up to, they need to know what libraries are in general. They need to know what our library is. It takes a really long time. And then they come up with really cool things like transfer students. No one in my whole institution is talking about transfer students. Even though everywhere across the country, transfer student enrollment is going up and up and up. And in my institution, which is already super majority minority, we have even more in our transfer student population, but it never even occurred to me. And it was so obvious because my student who I hired this past year is a transfer student, but it took us 6 months to get to that like obvious question because you had to sit and listen for a while and do that like slow research piece of it.
I think the just listening to you guys talk makes me think so much. So I should probably stay there and not talk. But one of the things, because I'm also interested in information literacy, like some of you have mentioned, and one of the things, Catherine, your project sounds really fascinating. Can't wait to hear more about it. But one of the things that kind of has come up with that is how invisible search is. And there's a few good citations, which I can look up and post in the chat afterwards, about how, you know, our information practices that we pursue every day, even all of us, our students, whoever, like how automatic and invisible they are. And so some of the methodologies where we you know, are guided by our participants, and then allow participants to really kind of guide us, maybe with some prompting of reflection to make some of those invisible things more visible. I just think that's so interesting, right? To look at what hasn't been considered, not because it's not important, but just maybe also because people are rushing through their lives, rushing through their assignments, rushing through their degrees, rushing through, you know, it's not just us that maybe want to slow down sometimes. So, so yeah, I just, that's it. Making things more visible. Just also wraps up with some of the methodology stuff, like just assuming you know, your 4 questions. Maybe those aren't the 4 right questions to ask, right? So let's talk about that more. Let's make the process of coming up with the questions more visible. There's just so much to unpack there.
Catherine, I don't have much to add, but I completely agree. And I think to Marie's point, and maybe to Chris's point earlier, and I could see pushback on this, saying, that's great, you've taken a deep dive into 12 students. That's great, but that's such a small slice of the pie, right? But that could inform, you know, it doesn't necessarily preclude using that information or using that new insight about transfer students or whatever, and then using a quantitative method either to scale up or something like that. I'm not saying it has to be, but the two aren't necessarily apart either. You can do both, and it's, again, difficult, but certainly possible.
I'd like to throw out a question. related to using students as partners or collaborators. And the concern about exploitation that some students feel when they're being asked to contribute in ways that, and often in situations where there's hierarchy or, like there's a power dynamic in some way, or if they're a student worker, they're making, very little money but being asked to contribute professionally. And what you think about that and how you wrestle with that.
Can I just ask a clarifying question, Sophie? Are you talking about using students as research collaborators or students as research subjects, or both?
No, I think as collaborators, or inviting students, like in the open education movement. There's this emphasis on open pedagogy, for example, and students creating things and publishing openly. But in what way could that be exploitation of the students and their labor? And also this issue of hierarchy, this is for a class, there's a clear power imbalance in that they have a faculty member judging their work, they're being graded often, there's and also, what if they don't want to publish, for example, openly, with their identity being exposed in that way? Like, in what ways could, by being inclusive, could we also, potentially be inviting harm or risk for some communities, for some students, or for some who may feel exploited?
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Haley and I talk about this a little bit in our paper. We talk about compensation and we talk about credit, and we talk about it in kind of from the beginning. And so we have these kind of 10 principles of working with student collaborators, and a lot of what we get come from salient practices with faculty and student undergraduate research partnerships, because that seems more, I think what you're saying lends itself more to the undergraduate experience, right? Because I think in a graduate context, it's a little bit different, and we both work in undergraduate contexts. And I think that's always a question, especially when you have unpaid interns and all these kinds of things. So, definitely we would say, compensate, and then at the very beginning say, what would you, and then check in along the way. So I make whatever so every semester my student has their learning goals, and then they decide what the end product might be. And so that's for them to decide. And then at a certain point, if it becomes something where we might want to present, so for example, we think we might have enough research to present at JCLC this fall, which is I think a really good place for my student to go anyway, because I only work with students of color. And so I think that would be a really impactful experience for the student anyway. And so we'll talk about that and negotiate it. But I do feel that it always feels a little questionable, right? Because you're right about the power dynamics that go into it. And something that I thought was really interesting, it's kind of related, but not really. We're hiring a new NAIS, Native American Indigenous Studies faculty. We're doing a cluster hire. And so some of them have been on campus, and we've been talking a lot about Indigenous research methods. And I think this comes up in the participatory design framework too, but every time you present or talk about your research or anything, you check in with, and this is in terms of like a research subject, you check in with them who aren't really subjects anymore, they're your collaborators. And so anytime you're like, and this person said in this interview last Friday, oh, and I checked in with all 36 of my research collaborators to make sure that because this time, every other time they've said, yes, please share my picture, or yes, please share my information, but that might change over time. And so I think we need to honor the context where students are in the moment. So in the moment, if like, yeah, this is great, I feel okay doing it. But then in the future, they say, oh, I don't actually want to do this anymore. Don't put my name on this paper, or I don't want to be involved in this presentation. I think as long as we help them understand they can do it when they want to do it, and they can take it away when they don't want to do it. And making sure you have that opportunity along the way to check in with them about it. That's kind of the best thing I've come up with.
I can speak to this a little bit from the perspective of having been a student who I had an assistantship in a graduate program, and you know, there was an expectation that I work a certain number of hours a week, and at some point, I was invited to participate as a research collaborator with one of the faculty, and it wasn't made clear to me at the beginning that the assumption would be I'd be doing this outside of the hours. That would be basically the credit I would be getting for it would be to have a publication. And that was clarified for me sometime during the process. So that would have been good for me to have known at the beginning. You know, it was interesting because I think in academia there's this norm around kind of unpaid labor that we do for like academic credit, not class credit, but for prestige and et cetera. So I think maybe the assumption was like, yes, you'll be doing this and then you'll get this publication and it'll be good for your career, assuming that I wanted to go into academia. Whereas from my perspective as a student needing money, I thought that this was something I was going to be doing and making money along the way. So I would say just being really clear, like, you know, realizing where you're coming from as an academic librarian with maybe some of these assumptions around how things are valued, and just being clear about it at the outset. Like if you can't pay the student to work on a research project with you, you know, let them know, and let them know what other kind of benefits they will be getting from participating in it. It doesn't necessarily get rid of the power differential or any, you know, possible issues with that, but at least they're going into it a little more informed of the situation.
It's curious, Rosalind, I'm curious about the if it was an IRB study, like what the consent kind of looks like for going back to your participants every time you're presenting again, or every time you're kind of iterating again on that project. And the other thing that makes me think about is there's an informed consent process for participants in research, but what about our collaborators, like in that case, right? Like I don't think there's anything in my IRB process about you know, if I'm going to have a grad student work on a project with me, or an undergraduate researcher, like there's nothing around that, like to guide me or educate me on how that goes. So is that clear? I don't know. It struck me that we're concerned about consent for our participants, but in this case here that Sophie just brought up about collaborators, there's like at my institution, in any case, there's kind of no structure there for me to look at, to be like, well, what should I be doing here? There's no guidance other than maybe looking to places like this for guidance.
Yeah, to the IRB point and the example I gave, I have no idea how that goes with IRB. But I think if you have in your, because I do for my implied consent with the students I work with, I have in there that they can say no to sharing their information at any point throughout the whole process. So that's already in my consent for like my research subjects. But for the student, I just do like an expectations and we call them the learning goals, but it's really like everything they're going to do, you know, how many hours, what they're going to get paid, all of that at the beginning of the semester. So they know, and then I know kind of what the expectation, and I'll say what I'm going to do for them too. So what they can expect of me. And so if I'm not doing something, they can go to this document and say, hey, this hasn't happened yet. Again, power differentials. But I try to say, if I'm not holding up my end of the bargain either, then we can talk about it. That's kind of the best that I've come up with. That's a really interesting, like, would that be in the IRB process with research collaborators, right? Because you have your PI and then I don't know. People who know more about it. What do you think?
I don't know on that, but I was also I think Hillary asked a clarifying question about whether we were talking about students as collaborators or students as subjects of research. And the intersectional qualitative research, I mean, I've been thinking about this anyway, but it was sort of, brought up again to the forefront of my mind with the intersectional qualitative research talk was, I feel this I work at an HBCU, right? And as a white person working in an HBCU, I'm very mindful of like those power dynamics that would exist with wanting to conduct research there, especially involving students. At the same time, I also recognize that HBCUs and minority serving institutions and tribal colleges are really underrepresented in the LIS literature. So I sort of feel that tension. I don't want to like overstudy, right? But at the same time, these are stories and experiences that deserve to be lifted up. That's something I think about a lot. Is, a lot of LIS research happens, at our own institutions, right? So what does it mean for us to keep drawing on students as research subjects? Though I will say it does, as a scholarship of teaching and learning, I mean, that's what you have to do, right? But you have to think about how to best do that really carefully and thoughtfully.
And just to, I guess, comment on all of that, we have all of these scholars that we can revisit when we are sort of working with these underrepresented groups in literature. We know that we can maybe go back and consult the work at Dr. McClellan's lab to make sure that our questions or how we sort of frame this is not racist or sexist. And then we have the other scholars' work to make sure that we, maybe we use all of these different terms and are comfortable with all of them. And we use, Hispanic, Latinx, Latin, Latina, and all of these in one body of research and sort of get comfortable with exposing people over and over to how this might appear in research, and even using like Negro and colored and Black and African American in research. So I think that while all of those issues are sort of complicated, we don't have to think about them sort of in a vacuum.
I know this is not exactly on the research side of things of us as research practitioners, but one of the things I've been thinking about as I look back on this whole series was how a lot of what I learned from the speakers or the issues that they brought up help the practice of being a librarian as well. Like, I might not be able to undertake a project on a great scale right now, balancing other projects against it, that would draw upon some of those issues of like responding to survey questions, right? Tell me what this means, create your own scale. But that might be something that I can do in my instruction assessment, right? I might be able to ask students to tell me a little bit more about what they mean when they say X, right? In a, assessment form at the end of a session, things like that, asking them to self-define what's going on there. So I've been thinking about the ways that it would not be just appropriate for research, but also for what we do every day as well.
Does anyone else have any final thoughts to share? My sh came too early. I want to thank you all. This has been wonderful. Just a great way to spend presidents. This is how we celebrate President's Day, I guess, right? Did anyone have any final shots? Oh, I did it again. Thoughts?
I just want to say it was a great opportunity to reflect on what research outside of the LAS. It was so refreshing to get outside of our field in a sense, and that helped me get new perspective on what research in LAS could be. So just thanks all for the interesting speakers.
So since our time is just about up, would it be okay if I wrapped us up for the day? So thank you to this team that organized the entire 2022 IRDL Scholars Speaker Series. Catherine, Sophie, Letha, Kathy, Michael, Hillary, Rosalinda, Dana. You chose great speakers that have provided us with a lot to consider moving forward. Thank you to Loyola Marymount University for its support of the Institute for Research Design in Librarianship. Thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for your consistent grant support of IRDL since 2014. So this is the final event of the 2022 IRDL Scholars Speaker Series. We'll see you again in 2023. Thank you all for being here. Have a great day.